Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and let me first welcome you all to a delayed start to our MEI seminar today. A delay 100% due to Melbourne Energy Institute and nothing to do with our esteemed guest, who's always on time. And he was going to be here perfectly on time for a 1 o'clock seminar when we advertised it for 12:30. So I apologise, Ross, and I apologise to all of you for our mistake. Before we begin, of course, we want to acknowledge the lands on which we're gathered, both in person and remotely. In where we are right now, they're the lands of the Wurundjeri, Wurrung and Bunurong people. But of course, there are lands all over Australia, and if you're not in Australia, elsewhere, with their own traditional owners, and we acknowledge all of them. Thanks for coming today for our last MEI Network Seminar Series for 2023. And we're talking about fiscal policy, particularly as it pertains to energy commodities, something that our guest speaker has been working on for a while. I won't read Ross's CV. You know a lot of it, and we're a little late starting, so I'd like to hear more from our speaker, less from me. Yeah. So welcome all, welcome Ross, and over to you, sir.
Thank you, Michael, and sorry for holding you all up. And once I heard that it was 12:30, not 1, I got on my bike, rode very fast and had a prang and had done some damage to my knee. I'll stand up if I can, but if I can't, I'll sit down there. Lots of discussion of fiscal policy related to the zero carbon transition. Lately, inspired by the US Inflation Reduction Act and the European and Japanese response to that. Lots of people saying we've got to do something similar ourselves, and certainly it should make us think again about what we are doing. But I think we've got to see that US action in context. And see the US and Australia in context. And that's what I'll be seeking to do in the presentation today. And have we still got an hour, or do we have to end at 1:30?
I'd like to take the full hour. You're available, and if our guests are available.
Okay, well, I'll hear things to that. Well, as I first set out in the book Superpower 4 years ago, and in more detail in the Superpower Transformation, the edited volume that we brought out late last year, Australia has 5 huge advantages in the zero carbon world economy. Of course, we had advantages in the high carbon world economy. We've got the 4th biggest coal reserves in the world, similar in quantity to China, and behind only Russia and the US, and got very large natural gas reserves and coal seam gas reserves, so proportionately not so large as with coal, but very large in the global scheme of things. And we're a very big exporter of those things. In some years, we were the largest exporter of LNG, not quite now, with Qatar and US sometimes pipping us. Put metallurgical and thermal coal together, we're the biggest exporter of coal in the world. We're a big exporter, and China's not, and the US isn't, because domestic demand is relatively low. We've only got 26 million people, and though we're high-income people consuming far more fossil energy per head than the rest of the world, we hardly make a dent in those huge reserves. So we've got what economists call comparative advantage in the fossil energy industries. We are naturally a big exporter. What matters in comparative advantage is your resources relative to domestic demand, relative to those ratios in the rest of the world and in the fossil energy world for coal and gas. Those ratios made us naturally the world's biggest exporter of coal and just about the biggest exporter of gas. Australia's comparative advantage, when you analyse it, is greater in the zero carbon world economy than in the fossil energy economy, probably by a large margin, but we're still working on the numbers to give us the margin. We've got probably absolutely the best combinations, best quantities and combinations of wind and solar resources in the world. We're in the right latitudes. Very best solar in the world is around the two tropics, 23 degrees north and south. Get close to the equator and we've got too much cloud and sun, and cyclonic events make a mess of solar farms. Go further south and you get big variations between solar in the day and night, summer and winter. Summer and winter, day length and night length, and we're sitting straddling the Tropic of Capricorn. Get a few hundred kilometres from both coasts, away from the clouds and the cyclones, and it's just about the best solar resource in the world, and it keeps on going. There's very little economic use made of that land. Compare us with the densely populated, high-income industrial countries of Europe and Northeast Asia. They've put them together, China included, and they've barely got the landmass of Australia, but they certainly don't have the wind and solar resources. I was in China talking to all the big energy companies and companies that use energy for 9 days 2 weeks ago, and they're really focused now on the requirement from on high to meet that zero carbon objective. They use 30% of the world's electricity. About the same ratio that comes from coal as it does for us. They're going to need every bit of solar and wind resource they've got just to decarbonise the electricity that's already there. If you decarbonise steel making as well, you more than double Chinese demand for electricity if you use the route that actually probably any of the routes to decarbonisation at the moment. It looks like using hydrogen rather than coking coal to reduce iron oxide to iron metal. A lot of research is being put onto electrolysis, so that one day we may be able to do something similar to what we're doing with aluminium and just put the electricity through molten pure iron oxide, but we can't do that anywhere near commercially now. But that will use just as much electricity. So, and China simply doesn't have the renewable energy resources to do it. It's got a very strong commitment to decarbonise. China produces a bit over half of the world's steel, over 1 billion tonnes a year. We know how much metallurgical coal that needs. They've got a higher proportion of that coal coming directly from iron ore using blast furnaces than the developed countries, because the history of steel use is younger, so they don't have much scrap. Eventually they'll catch up, but that'll take a generation or two. China's blast furnace use of metallurgical coal accounts for about 4% of global emissions, compared with all of Australia for everything we do, with all the profligate use we make of petroleum and coal, where we account for about 1.25% of world emissions. So China's blast furnace use of coal generates as many emissions as everything we do in Australia, roughly. And if electricity is to be the root of that directly one day, not now, or indirectly through hydrogen, they'll need more electricity for that than for everything they do with electricity now. But also, they're leading the world in electrification of transport. In China, you've got to have a green number plate if you drive an electric car. Driving around the middle of Shanghai for a couple of days, stuck in traffic a bit. You've got to do something with your brain. So I counted, and 40% of the cars I saw had a green number plate. Now, the middle of Shanghai is not the average for China by any means, but it makes the point. And 40% of new cars this year are electric cars. Not as high as Scandinavia, but 5 times as high as new cars in Australia. And that all is increased demand for electricity. So China can't do it on its own, but China could get closer to doing it on its own than Germany or Western Europe as a whole, or Japan or Korea. Just a nice little remark. I was talking to the chairman of the biggest of their energy companies, and he said, we wish the go-by desert was bigger. He said, we've got quite a nice desert out there, but that won't be enough. Will you let us use your deserts? Wind resources. We're at the right latitude for good wind. And even if Germany or Japan or Korea or central China or coastal China had the solar and wind resources that we've got, there's nowhere to put solar panels. It's already a debate in Germany. I said in my first chapter in the superpower transformation that for Australia to meet what I judge to be conservative and minimalist perspectives on our role as an exporter of zero carbon products in the zero emissions world economy, I said we'd be using about 8% of the world's renewable energy. If half of it came from wind and half from solar, the solar would cover about 0.5% of the Australian landmass. We've got about 7.5 million square kilometres. 0.5% doesn't sound all that much. I think it's about, you do the maths, 35,000 square kilometres. Where in Germany can you find now 20 square kilometres? Or Japan, where can you find 1? I was talking to the Chinese company that's got an agreement with Singaporean interests to help in decarbonisation of Singapore. And they looked all over the island and they gave up. And so they're putting in about 1/4 of a square kilometre of sea-based floating solar. And they said, well, the rest will have to come from Australia. So that's our first advantage. Huge wind and solar resource of very high quality near land that doesn't have high value economic uses. That doesn't mean to say they're not important pieces of land to people who live there. And so for this all to work, we've got to have the engagement of people who live there. That's an important part of building Australia's superpower. A second big advantage is that we've got incomparable opportunities for sustainable growing and harvesting of biomass and for carbon land sequestration. This is an interest in these things. It's something I've shared with Robin for a lot of years. One of Robin's successors, Alan Finkel's never quite bought it, but it's actually a huge requirement of the world to use trees and plants to convert atmospheric carbon dioxide into carbon and to sequester that into the soil or into plants, or use the biomass from the plants as a base for zero carbon chemical industries. Some of the chemical industries will be converted into use indirectly of solar energy. We can make the nitrogenous fertilizers that are currently made out of fossil hydrocarbons. We can make them out of a combination of hydrogen, renewable hydrogen from renewable energy, and a small amount of renewable biomass based carbon dioxide. Similarly, methanol is going to be very important for transport fuels. Increasingly, it's looking to be the vehicle for decarbonisation of shipping, and possibly for some land transport and for long-distance civil aviation. Well, you can hydrogen made from biomass, well, from renewable electricity and combined with some carbon dioxide from biomass can produce that. Needs some substantial quantities of biomass, but some of the chemical inputs into chemical manufacturers, you just need highly intensive hydrocarbons and carbon. And at the moment, it comes from coal and oil and gas. That's going to have to come from biomass, where there aren't the synthetic alternatives. Australia has about 10 times the woodland per capita of the OECD as a whole, and the developed countries have several times the woodland per capita of the developing countries. So, our woodland doesn't have the high value economic uses on average of those in other developed countries. And so that gives us another great source of comparative advantage. Combine that with the opportunities for low cost production of renewable hydrogen from renewable energy. And we are naturally the low-cost producer of methanol and nitrogenous fertilizers and explosives. A lot of other things probably end up making explosives closer to where they're used. Will supply the Australian mining industry, but someone else will supply European armaments to Ukraine because it's dangerous to take them too far across the waters. But just supplying the nitrogenous fertilizers for the world and methanol for the world, or a quarter of it from Australia, it adds up to being very large. Third big advantage, we are, not by a small amount, but overwhelmingly the world's largest exporter of the mineral ores that require large amounts of energy for turning into metals. Historically, the standouts have been iron and aluminium. We're by far the world's biggest exporter of iron ore. With current technologies and those that look prospective over the next decade or so, hydrogen will be made from renewable energy, will be the vehicle for zero emissions processing. And it will make no sense to take Australian iron ore and Australian hydrogen to Korea to turn into steel. Japan and Korea have very competitive steel industries. They supply a lot of the world. Well, they supply their own metal manufacturers to go to the world, their own cars to go to the world, but they also supply directly a lot of steel to the world. And they import metallurgical coal from Australia, mostly from Australia. We're by far the world's biggest exporter of metallurgical coal. And iron ore, mostly from Australia is the biggest source, and then converted into steel there. But you won't do that to turn Australian iron ore into metal with zero emissions in Korea or Japan or Shanghai or Germany, because hydrogen's much more difficult to transport. We'll do it here. If economics has got anything to do with it, and economics in the end has a lot to do with it. It was economics that drove the Chinese steel industry to the very big decision to become dependent on a capitalist country allied with the United States for the iron ore to supply the world's biggest steel industry. That was a big decision. When I was ambassador in the 80s, I spent a heck of a lot of time talking to ministers and the Premier, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, and at every university that invited me about how China wouldn't reach its development goals if it tried to be self-sufficient in low-grade Chinese iron ore they were using in their iron blast furnaces, 30% ores. They're trying to concentrate. It costs a fortune to concentrate it. And I said, you're not going to meet your development goals if you don't use high quality international stuff. Anyway, they respected that and made me an honorary professor, still am, at China's one specialist iron and steel university, the Wuhan Iron and Steel University. When I gave my opening address, opening lecture, inaugural lecture, I made all these points and said, if China is going to succeed in its development programs, by the end of the century, you'll be importing more than 20 million tons a year. This was beginning of 88, more than 20 million tons a year of iron ore from Australia. And the premier at the time was Li Peng. He put out a press release in Xinhua. A few weeks later, didn't mention me or the Australian ambassador. He said, some foreigners say that by the end of the century, we'll be importing 20 million tons of iron ore, but they don't understand the Chinese situation. Well, China's now importing about 1 billion tons a year of iron ore. And it will be the same story with zero carbon iron. Then there were objections. What will happen to the employment of 2 million people employed in iron ore mining? Well, they found other jobs. How could China rely on imports for an industry so important for security? Well, they can't rely on iron ore imports, and it's actually, more dependent on global supplies if you're importing iron metal than iron ore. The arguments fell in the face of overwhelming economic imperatives. Well, the economic imperatives are actually stronger in turning iron ore into iron metal. They've got to get to zero carbon. They recognize that. They take that very seriously. They won't do it by importing hydrogen, nor will Japan or Korea or Germany, although all of them are talking about doing that now because, well, we all know in this room, hydrogen is the smallest molecule. It takes, it slips out between the molecules of standard steel. You need special materials. You can make them, but they're expensive. Hydrogen won't liquefy till you get nearly to absolute zero, minus 253. And so you need half the energy in the hydrogen just to liquefy it. A bit more at the other end as you sort it all out. Well, you can convert it into ammonia, but that's an awful lot of capital in the Haber-Bosch process. More energy, more capital, but basically not directly contributing to the iron making. Might as well use that in making the iron. So ammonia is going to be too expensive to use as a source of hydrogen for industry. It'll be used in areas of economic activity that don't compete with imports. Singapore might import it to run cars, for example. It won't be a serious blow to the competitiveness of the Singaporean economy to run cars on expensive electricity from Northern Territory and expensive hydrogen from somewhere in Australia. But it would make a mess of the competitiveness of Korean or Japanese steel industry to rely on imported hydrogen or ammonia. Well, they won't do it. And we're by far the world's major source of exports of iron oxide, aluminium oxide. We do process a little bit of the aluminium oxide here, the smelters in Gladstone and Newcastle and Portland. We used to do more. When I first started seriously studying the Japanese economy in '69, and between then and the next half dozen years, Japan became the world's, well, outside Russia, the Western world's biggest producer of aluminium. Then the oil price shock, the Arab embargoes, and made them think that such heavy dependence on imported fossil energy wasn't great, good to modify it. So they quite deliberately chose to send aluminium offshore. That's when we got our aluminium industry. That's when we actually had 3 smelters at Newcastle at one stage using coal, and one at Gladstone and one at Portland. That was a very deliberate policy decision. Really a foretaste of what's going to happen later with more aluminium smelting around the world and with iron ore smelting. There are a lot of others, a lot of the processing, a lot of the critical minerals we hear a lot about is energy intensive, not as energy intensive as aluminium and iron, but energy intensive. So we're the natural home for some of that processing. Silicon's a big one. The main active input into solar panels, as well as in huge demand for computers. And China produces more than 90% of the silicon used in the world's solar panels. China doesn't have a comparative advantage in silicon. They were a bit clever. They recognized the world was going to go to zero carbon for the rest of us, so they cornered the market on a lot of the industries that are going to be important in the zero carbon economy. But being first gives them some advantages, but it doesn't take away the disadvantages. And silicon requires three big inputs: high grade quartz or sand, silicon oxide. They've got high grade silicon oxide in the west of China, a long way away from where they do, mostly from where they do the process. Needs a lot of pure carbon for the reductant process. In the zero emissions world, that's got to be biocarbon. You can make it. It'll be made out of Australian biomass through pyrolysis processes. We actually did that in iron making in West Australia before we had a big iron ore export industry at Wundowie, the charcoal-based pig iron plant. That charcoal could be used for silicon manufacture. We've got one silicon producer in Australia, produces about 1% of the world's silicon. Very high quality, good reputation. Japanese company at Kemerton near Collie in Western Australia. It built its silicon carbon on offcuts, making charcoal out of offcuts from the Yarra sawmilling industry, but that industry fell into disrepute. The supply fell away, and so now they mostly import anthracite to get the quality. They've got to go all the way to Colombia to get Colombia to Bunbury in Western Australia. They've got to transship it in Canadian ports. They're pretty expensive. The anthracite to begin with of that grade, very expensive when you start, and by the time it gets to them, it's pretty expensive. Well, China uses anthracite and variations on that theme. They've got a bit more than us, but they can't use that in the zero carbon world economy, and that will be a disadvantage for them. But silicon processing is enormously energy intensive per kilogram of output, far more energy intensive than aluminium smelting. And China doesn't have the renewable energy resources to do that at scale. So pure economics would say it doesn't make much sense for China to supply more than 90% of the world's silicon. Now, for strategic reasons, the Western countries would feel more comfortable about half the world's silicon coming from somewhere else. Well, it actually is also economically sensible for half of it to come from Australia. The fourth advantage is that we happen to be the world's largest, world's largest resources taken together of what's come to be called critical minerals. Mike Sanderford, in his chapter in Superpower Transformation, talks about energy transition minerals, because we don't like to say that aluminium and iron, the metals of the old industry, are not critical. But their demand in future will be not all that different to demand in the past. Aluminium might be a bit more, steel might be a little bit less, but they won't change. But there's a number of minerals, and especially metals, that will be required in much higher proportions in the zero carbon economy than now. And we happen to have the world's best resources of them taken together. That's just a mining advantage. The superpower opportunity is the processing side, and all of the issues I've raised related to the cost of energy and processing are relevant to that. Our fifth advantage is that the old industries, mining, forestry, agriculture, have a lot of the skills, and especially the industrial culture that's necessary for the new industries. The easiest, cheapest way to start building the superpower is in the old centres of the coal industry, where you've got the electricity transmission, the water, the ports, and a labour force that's got a lot of relevant skills, but above all, a community that doesn't mind new industrial activity. You try and put an aluminium smelter, even the cleanest aluminium smelter in the world of Brighton, or even in the middle of Geelong these days, there's no hope. But try and put it in Moranbah as the coal runs down, and they love it. And so having the industrial culture is very important. Taken a bit long, and that's I'll speed up. In contrast, the high-income, densely populated countries of Europe and Northeast Asia don't have any of these skills, and they've got a huge demand for all of the products of the zero-carbon world economy. They won't get there and won't get to zero emissions unless they import a whole lot of goods embodying zero emissions, energy and biomass. Do the arithmetic, see where Japan or Korea's got any chance of doing that. Now, my estimate that we can reduce global emissions directly by reducing our own emissions by 1.3% and indirectly by another 7% by producing zero carbon goods for the densely populated high income countries of Europe and Northeast Asia. It's a very conservative estimate. Korea and Japan, I said, well, they'll produce half what they need themselves. They might get floating solar halfway across the Sea of Japan. Hard to see it, but you might. So I said, let's say Japan and Korea produce half of the renewables they need for their complete decarbonisation. And for the other half, we supply the same proportion of the zero carbon goods that we supply of LNG and coal, around half. Those two taken together for those two countries. Then I said, let's assume it wasn't too sophisticated in the rest of it. I said, let's assume we get 1/10 of that share in China and Europe. And you come to Australia, reducing global emissions by 7% by exporting zero carbon goods to the rest of the world. The right number, we're still working on the arithmetic for the other countries, but I'd end up 20%. But 7% is what I used for a nice conservative number. The natural markets are Northeast Asia and Europe, not America. America will be broadly self-sufficient. They lack some things, some energy transition minerals, we can supply them. But America's a huge economy, but it's not very important in Australian trade. Our exports to China are 20 times as big as our exports to America. The ratio will be something like that for exports to China and Japan and Korea compared with America. But Europe's different. Yeah, America's got substantial renewable energy resource of its own. The IRA is about decarbonising America. It's going to cost a fortune. The US is running the biggest budget deficit as a share of the economy that any economy in history has run when it's near full employment. You expect budget deficits to be small when you've got near full employment. Well, America's got the biggest ever in history in any developed country, 6% of GDP. It's expected to be bigger next year as the IRA goes. The IRA is completely uncapped. That is raising the cost structure of the United States, making the US uncompetitive in everything. The exchange rate's going up, the higher inflation than we've got. The exchange rate's going up rapidly against the whole world. They'll become uncompetitive at everything. They'll keep a car industry going because the IRA subsidizes purchase of American cars, but not German or Japanese or Korean or Chinese. So they're staying competitive in the domestic market through protection. That makes them less competitive in Korea and Japan and China and Germany. So forget about the US IRA making them a competitor with Australia for the superpower label. They'll be flat out decarbonising themselves. That's what the IRA is really about. Because we need a strong America, I just hope they don't make too much of a mess of the economy as a whole while they're doing it. The natural markets are Europe, Korea, Japan, China. And we've got no near competitor internationally. Some people say Saudis, you've got a lot of good sun. Well, Saudi's a pretty small place, and they don't have the minerals for processing. They could import Australian iron ore, Australian aluminium. They're already doing that a little bit. They could grow biomass by desalinating water. They're doing a little bit of that, but to think of them being comparable to Australia, they'll play some role in European decarbonisation. We won't get 100%. I say we get 10%. We'll get a lot more than Saudi Arabia. And which European country, or Japan or Korea, which of them is going to feel comfortable about heavy reliance on the Middle East as a source of energy-intensive products? They've been uncomfortable enough about the current reliance on petroleum. And of course, our small economy relative to our resources makes us very different from most other countries with rich renewable energy resources, even Brazil. I've already been through some of this story, but it's going to require huge investment. Just that 7% would require investment of 5.5% of GDP for several decades. This will take several decades. Take the whole time it takes the world to decarbonize. That looks impossible. 5.5% of GDP is a hell of a lot of money. At the moment, it's well over $100 billion a year. But and looks impossible until we think that we restructured the Australian economy to supply the minerals that China needed during its period of strong growth. It grew, China between 2002 and 2012 grew more strongly than any country ever has over such a sustained period. It happens to be the most populous country in the world, happens to lack the resources that we've got. And during that time, at a peak, we were investing 7.8% of GDP in mining, mostly to supply the expansion of the Chinese market. On average, over that time, it's not very different to that 5.5%. So if we can do it to make sure that China's got enough minerals to keep its rapid growth going, is it a big question to ask? Can we do it to make sure the world gets to zero carbon emissions? Quite... Yes, includes the gas. Yeah. The three biggest were gas, coal, iron ore, but quite a lot of others. If we do this right and manage our economy right, we can have full employment with those rising incomes for a growing population for a generation. So it's a big nuisance, structural change like that. Mining boom was a bit of a nuisance, but the prize is full employment and rising income for a growing population for at least a generation. See everyone here through. Okay. So the role of government, I identify half a dozen main roles. There's no getting away from the well, first of all, the economically strong case for carbon price. This is simple economics. If one business is doing damage to other businesses, it should pay for it. We used to let anyone who wanted to make vinegar or soap in Collingwood just pour the crap into the Yarra. But once the problem became too big, we banned it. There was a time when construction was a bit of a free-for-all. Got to go back to the 19th century, but the cheapest way to get rid of the rubble on a building site was to throw it into the block next door. And that's what you did until it was banned. We banned that. Well, we're doing quite a lot of damage, much more damage than we ever did from throwing crap into the Yarra or into the neighbour's block from carbon dioxide emissions. And economics said there's two ways of handling that. One is banning it, and the other is putting a cost equal to the damage that's done. It's pretty good tax. If we had the carbon arrangements, the ETS that we'd legislated in 2012 and Tony Abbott got rid of Tony Abbott with the Mining Council and the Business Council got rid of on 1st of July. They got rid of it on 30th of June 2014. On the 1st of July, we would have had a link to Europe. And so our carbon price would have been linked to Europe. There would have been absolutely no question of anything produced in Australia meeting all of the European requirements and being freely accessible without any border penalties to Europe. Selling iron ore or silicon or aluminium would get the huge premiums you get in the European market. That would be pretty good for us. But another thing would be good for us. We'd be generating revenues of about $72 billion a year. Now, 72 billion is a fair bit of dough. We could reduce every rate of income tax by 30%, from the highest to the lowest, with 70 billion a year. 72 billion a year is 2.5 times the annual cost of Medicare. Some people wonder if we'll ever be able to afford those submarines, but 5 or 6 years of a carbon price and pay for the submarines. That's a bit harder than Medicare or a 30% tax cut, but we could do it. If you don't have the carbon price, then you've got to have stopgap alternatives. And I can go into that later, but easy for renewable energy, extend the RET until we've got a carbon price, I suggest in the book. We take the carbon price out of today's politics and let's say we'll need it one day. Let's say we'll have it in 2035 and get everyone used to that idea so it's not a big political deal when it comes. But in the meantime, we can extend the RET. But for other industries, I noticed that yesterday, the chief executive, Australian chairman of Tesla, was saying we've got to subsidise lithium production. Well, you might be able to make a case for lithium production, or for iron production, zero emissions iron production, or for zero emissions silicon production, or for growing trees. You'd find the cheapest things to do if you had a carbon price. So Robin should be arguing for a general carbon price, and if lithium processing makes sense, then it will happen. It'll have to compete with everything else. Second role of government support for innovation, really important. You don't get enough innovation unless you get fiscal support for it. The reason for that is that the innovator develops a lot of knowledge, accepts a lot of costs that teach everyone else what to do and what not to do. Business school down the road here teaches what you must never be as a business person is an innovator. Never be the first to use a technology, be a clever follower, because you learn from what everyone else has done. Almost any new technology the first time you'll make a lot of mistakes. The second people learn those and don't make them. That's why there's a strong economic case for general fiscal support for innovation, and you need it more when innovation is required quickly, and it's needed quickly in the zero carbon economy. It's what we do through ARENA in a way. It'd be better if it was much more generally applied across the zero emissions economy. The first grid-scale solar farm at Ningham received a grant about half the capital cost to bring its costs down to the competing costs. After we put in a few of those, ARENA gave support to the first few. After we put in a few, the costs came down dramatically. About half the cost of the domestic Australian costs, or half the cost of the equipment, mainly coming from China, from companies that have been educated in electrical engineering in Australia. But half was Australian costs, and those costs came down dramatically as we learned how to do it better, to do the construction better. CEFC, but I think we need some general system of fiscal support across the whole zero emission space for innovation. Pick up what Tesla wants, lithium processing, but not as a special thing. If it qualifies for innovation and in the zero carbon space, then and they get their share like everyone else. Third role of government, public provision of infrastructure that is a natural monopoly or requires high coordination cost for multiple users. The standout is electricity transmission. We used to have pretty cheap electricity transmission. Now we've got just about the most expensive in the developed world. Any economist taught in microeconomics would know that if you apply the approach to regulation of transmission that we do, that's the result you get. Version Johnson, an article in the American Economic Review in 2063, all points to one conclusion: do not regulate a natural monopoly by reference to rate of return on investment. Well, we regulate through rate of return on investment. You create a huge incentive for overinvestment. So that's what we've got. Superpower will be built probably mainly outside southeastern Australia, at least in the initial stages, because there you're not so reliant on the regulated transmission lines. And probably the horse is bolted in New South Wales and Victoria, but let's be cleverer in other places. Exactly the same issues will arise with hydrogen transmission, hydrogen storage, transport and storage. Upper Spencer Gulf, a wonderful place to start, maybe the best place in the world to start with large-scale industrial use of hydrogen. 4 potential ports that could be used: Whyalla, Port Pirie, both Whyalla and Port Pirie, huge centres of minerals processing now, or huge by Australian standards, not by Kilbay standards. Port Bonython, Port Augusta, for different industries, they might all end up very important. They've got a very good electricity transmission from the old days when Port Augusta was the centre of South Australia's coal-based transmission. But other infrastructure, including ports, connect them all with hydrogen transport and storage, and it reduces the cost of all of them. You don't want every, it might end up being 20 manufacturers using hydrogen. You don't want everyone supplying its own hydrogen transport and storage, just like you don't want everyone putting in their own transmission lines. You don't want 20 different transmission lines alongside each other to an industrial area. So fortunately with hydrogen, we can start again and get that right. Power system reliability has some of the same features. If a power system goes wrong, it imposes huge costs on everyone. So I think there's a role for government just in backing up the reliability of the whole system. I say in the superpower transformation that the natural role of Snowy is to play that backup role. If you just make it part of the system, trading in the market like everything else is not there to come in and back up the system later on. And establishment of industrial precincts where you've got to coordinate a lot of things, access to land, environmental approvals, port, water, electricity. Sometimes you need a number of complementary industries to establish at the same time. That's a role of government of a similar kind. Fourth thing is the role of government in trade policy. Fairly obvious, but just as our role at the embassy in persuading the Chinese that open trade in iron ore was good for them, we've got to do that for everyone, because it's not obvious to everyone. The economic realities are strong, but someone's got to explain them. And there's all sorts of trade policy, tariffs and other protection and other interventions. The American IRA, they get in the way, specialization according to comparative advantage. So the role for government in sorting that out. Also need open access on the import side. If we're going to be competitive, we have to have access to the world's cheapest and best engineering and capital goods. What happens if one country, the US, wants to subsidize some industry? Some people say we should introduce the same sort of subsidy. Well, the US subsidy might weaken our prospect in some industry in which the US happens to be very strong, but it shouldn't affect domestic policy. And I don't think it will be very important in our main markets in Europe and Northeast Asia. If the US wants to do, as there was some discussion at that last ANZUS ministerial meeting on AUKUS or Quad ministerial meeting, if they want to subsidize some of our critical minerals, fine, that's great. If they want to pay more for lithium so that it goes to the US, not to China, that's great. But they should pay for it. That's not our industry policy, that's their industry policy. And fifth role of government, very important one, sharing a vision of the future to guide private investment decisions. Things we're talking about, I've been thinking about them for a long time. So they seem pretty obvious. I hope they seem pretty obvious to you, but they're not obvious to everyone in business. And very elementary questions become roadblocks. How do we know that Saudi Arabia solar won't do us out of all the things we want to do? That's one question I've got a few times. So there's a role of government, a role of public institutions like this one in providing information, knowledge, public education, and then political leadership. I think South Australia will lead Australia because its leadership's got the message and is explaining to its community and to people the opportunity and what's at stake. Thanks, Michael. And I will.
You will see. Yes.
It has different, yeah.
Okay, I need to get my computer as well, because sorry, Franca. There'll be some questions online as well, no doubt. Thanks, Ross. A wonderful talk and a brave talk today, given the accident. Now, questions from the room and questions from online, very welcome. So in the room first, Pat, I've got a few myself. Yes, sir.
And Michael, I've got as much time as you like.
Good.
Yeah, hi Ross, very interesting. I'm Kevin Nitsky from Lockheed Martin, from an energy storage technology vendor perspective. I'm just curious on your thoughts about competing, particularly out of the Middle East. We're seeing both talent go, whereas I'll be speaking with engineering organisations one week, ring up the next, and the engineer I was dealing with, bang, they're gone to Saudi for 3 years. And also from an investment point of view, you're looking at, well, how do you attract technology vendors to invest in Australia when there's, you know, some crazy money? I really appreciate your thoughts longer term about the limitations of Saudi, but I think there's some real shorter term challenges there for Australia. So keen on your thoughts there.
Yeah, I think we've got to be a bit careful about overreacting to short-term particular things. And Australia is not the home of every new economic activity in the zero carbon economy. We are the natural home for things that use intensively renewable energy, zero emissions energy, and that use that energy for processing Australian minerals, especially if the energy needs combination with biomass. These are the centers of the superpower. That's going to keep us, that with everything else we do, keep us fully employed for a generation. And there'll be some specialized things of other kinds where we've got some special advantage that will make the grade. But there's lots of things that won't make sense here. Anything that requires a lot of, we're going to be a labour, unless we can muck it up terribly, but if we don't muck it up, we're going to be a labour scarce economy paying high wages. We're not the natural home for something that's very intensive in use of labour. We're not the natural home for doing the detailed wiring that's necessary in a lot of electrical systems. So we're not the natural place to make electrolyzers, although good luck for Twiggy. I'm all in favour of everyone having a crack if they've done the work and know what they're doing, and they might have seen a reason why Australia has an advantage. And great, we want everyone to have a crack. And in fact, if we had a general system of support for innovation, I'd let the entrepreneur make that decision, as long as they're losing a fair bit of their own money as well as our money if it goes wrong. So I don't think that what's happening. The US is, the decarbonisation of the US under the IRA. It's spectacular. We've never had anything quite like this in history, and naturally it will attract talent and capital, but not forever. And our other economic advantages are very important. I think the important thing is for us to put in place the general economic policies that make sense for Australia. And that does include subsidies for innovation. Think a lot about how we get that right. Maybe in any new activity in the zero carbon economy, the first few players get half their capital costs paid. So long as criteria are met, like a genuine does involve innovation, at least in Australia, genuinely does involve progress towards a zero carbon economy. And if some entrepreneur wants to have a crack using those resources, let them try. But we're going to be short of labour. We're going to need enormous quantities of high-grade engineering and geology and metallurgy and financial management capacity to run the things we've got comparative advantage in. Yeah, and we shouldn't see it as a problem if we don't end up the place where everything happens.
We'll try and alternate in person, online, Ross.
Yep.
We've got very healthy audience online. So we have a question here, an interesting question about data assurance certificates and things like that, certificates of origin. How important will they play? Those sorts of things play a role. How important will the role be in demonstrating that we are playing by the rules in a zero carbon future, and this allow us to access particularly European, perhaps other markets?
Crucially important. Now, the certain low cost way of doing it would be to completely decarbonise ourselves. Then there's absolutely no question. Or to be on a clear path to decarbonisation. It's a little bit of a problem that we are a laggard. The 43% reduction on 2005 levels by 2030. It's a huge relief to me that it's within the range of developed countries, whereas before we were ridiculously below the range of developed countries. But we're just within the range. We're only within the range because Korea is 42%. Be on a path to zero emissions, the economy as a whole. And once we are zero emissions, and I actually think if we were running policies to make ourselves as rich as we possibly could, we'd have zero carbon net well before 2050, maybe 2035. That would answer all the questions. Now, we can be quite sure that European protectionism and American protectionism are going to be very important in this rather messy transition period. Americans are quite upfront about it. Even a zero emissions Mercedes won't be able to get into America, or even a Tesla made in China with zero emissions, even if it had zero emission steel, won't be able to get into America. And if you've got a bit of carbon in your supply chain, then the European manufacturers and lobbyists will find some way of keeping you out. So in addition to being clearly on a path to early zero emissions for the economy as a whole, we're going to need certificates of origin, and that's actually an important role of government, especially through this transition period. It won't matter once we're zero emissions, and the sooner we do that, the richer we'll be, but it matters a lot until then. That we had a bit of a false start on that with what was called the Red Joe paper put out late last year, which amongst other things would have allowed us to certify zero emissions electricity from Snowy Hydro and Tas Hydro as zero emission sources. But the economists like to develop general equilibrium models looking at how everything interacts with everything else. A consequence of that would have been that the proportion of zero carbon electricity going just to standard things we already do in Australia would actually fall. The carbon intensity of the other things we did would increase. And I think it would take the Europeans about 1 second to say, Barley's, you can't perform that trick. Extension of the RET and strengthening of it, the renewable energy certificate is a legitimate, legitimate way of demonstrating zero carbon that will be acceptable in Europe. But then for the other activities, the iron processing, we're going to need mechanisms for certifying the zero emissions. It's not just electricity in the supply chain. It'll be important in food. Europeans love protecting agriculture. You have a bit of urea made from gas in your supply chain. That'll be good enough reason to keep out Australian dairy products or grain. So we need a process of certification that beyond renewable energy that helps us through the transition period. But the shorter we make that transition period, the better.
Terrific. Any questions in the room? I've got one. While Matt's thinking, I've got a couple actually. Oh, hang on. No, we've got one in the back. Graham, how are you?
Yeah, hi Ross. I'm Graham Beardsmore here. I was in Mike Sanderford's stable in Earth Sciences. I spend my life thinking and trying to do geothermal energy, but that's sort of. And I'm actually appreciate your comments on China. I'll be there next week. Big geothermal energy conference in China.
I'd love it if you could win on geothermal energy.
Oh, so would I, believe me. But that's my question is actually not related to geothermal. It's just how receptive do you think Canberra and the state governments are to your story, which I think is very compelling?
Well, the Prime Minister on election night said that alongside the Voice, his big objective was to make Australia the renewable energy superpower. Every state premier has made a similar statement. Filling in the story, what's actually involved will take longer, and that's what we've all got to work on. I think there's goodwill. I don't doubt the intentions. But we've got to do the work on filling in how we get there. And that'll take a lot of work from all of us.
Tremendous amount of work and a wonderful opportunity too, Ross.
Yeah.
Well, hang on. I promised to alternate, but some hands went up here. So.
Thank you. Ross, I might come back to the commercial side of these things and making them all work. You have to have your carbon trading and how this is all going to be integrated. Are you coming up with new visions on how this is all going to happen again?
The best vision is the old one. If we still had what we put in place on July the 1st, 2012, we'd be in great shape. We'd be linked to Europe. Europe would be linked to California and Quebec and British Columbia. And China's got an emissions trading scheme now. It would see lots of advantages in linking so that it can get its cars into Europe, and Japan and Korea, and we'd gradually spread. American with Republicans controlling the House of Reps might take longer, but the advantages are so great that one day they might even see that. But so let's not give up on general carbon pricing. No one in government's talking about it now, but let's talk about it as something. Let's not forget its advantages, and let's talk about it being something that will happen one day. So it's when it's politically possible. Pending that, you've got to do rather messy things, a lot of different things. You need if you had the European carbon price, then zero emissions production of urea from green carbon dioxide and green renewable energy would be economic now, commercially economic now. If we had the link to Europe, which we would have had on 1st of July, that would happen all now. But in the absence, if you're not getting the green premium for the product, then you need some alternative to that. The extension of the renewable energy target is the obvious thing for electricity, and that's especially necessary because as solar grows, the price of solar in the hours when solar is available falls. It's only about 60% of the 24-hour average now, and that's one of the reasons why we're not getting new investment in solar. Confidence in continuation of something like the renewable energy target would do that. We need something like that in a lot of other industries. It would be economic right now to have green iron, green silicon, green urea, green a lot of other things if we had the European carbon price. And so we need other mechanisms to do that. Messy until we've got a general carbon price. And then the support for innovation. Because it doesn't involve a tax, an obvious tax, you still got to tax people to pay for it. Paying subsidies seems to be more attractive. We're doing a fair bit of that in one way or another, rationalising that the government's rewiring the nation scheme, I think, is an important step, especially for decarbonising the big states, New South Wales and Victoria. I think that the Minister for Industry's Australian Reconstruction Fund could play a big role, but with all these different schemes, we need someone to sit down and rationalize them and decide and work out how they all fit together so that they add up to general support for activities that contribute in this space. They're the two big ones: the support for innovation and the alternatives to a carbon price until we've got a carbon price.
Terrific. We've got a question online, and then we're going to be getting to 2 o'clock, which was our originally scheduled end of session. And I'm as moderator, I get to ask the last question, which is always one privilege of being moderator. From online, what is your current thinking on carbon capture and storage?
Yeah, if those of you who remember my 2008 report, remember that I had a fairly big role for that. I think, as I had for nuclear from the mid-20s, what's happened to relative costs of different technologies hasn't helped carbon capture and storage. Costs have seemed to increase while they've fallen for the alternatives. But I think that almost certainly there is a role when you have what is naturally a large, an economically rational source of large carbon emissions close to a geologically favourable structure. When those circumstances exist,
Yes,
then it will play a role. I think into the long-term future, it may be very important combining that with industrial use of biomass to generate negative emissions. So my view is that if we're generally providing fiscal support to new technologies that are part of the zero carbon story, I'd have carbon capture and storage qualify. But I think that its role is going to be a much smaller role than I anticipated 16 years ago.
Not, for example, on the back of a coal-fired power station making electricity.
It costs so much to capture that capture alone would cost more than solar and storage.
So I'll refrain from giving my opinions because it's not my seminar, but I agree with you on that, Ross. Couldn't fully refrain from that. Couple of minutes left, and the moderator's privilege. You talked a lot about China, big economy and growing extraordinary amount, and the United States and Europe. There's one other very large country that is possibly going to grow a lot economically. It will grow economically a lot in the next 30 years. It has almost as many people in it as China. In fact, it might have more people in it now. India. What about India? What about India and Australia, Ross?
India passed China in population at the beginning of this year.
Yes, wasn't sure when, but
and Chinese population is falling. India is still rising, although rising much less rapidly than it was, and that helps the stage of their economic development. I think that India has got a strong near-term economic future. The sort of growth they've had, 5 or 6% per annum, everything tells me that that's likely to be sustained on average, and it's already bigger than every economy in the world other than the US, China, Japan, and Germany. Will soon be bigger than Germany and Japan. Not much doubt about that. So it's a big one. Its emissions per capita are very low, strikingly low. Lots of them don't eat cows, and the average incomes are very low. They're starting to buy cars at a time when electric cars are more economic, so that they might leapfrog a period of heavy dependence on internal combustion cars. They don't have a lot of the heavy engineering industries that China has that use so much coal. I think the Indian steel industry is big, but it's probably only about an eighth the size of China, and so it can grow. It can doubling every 10 years, pretty rapid growth. So it's got to double a couple of times before it's half as big as China. China's will fall a bit because of the stage of development of that. They don't need as many new bridges and steel mills as they used to need. But that's a big story. India been a bit bolshy on the international decarbonisation effort. It says our per capita emissions are low. In history, we put very little into the atmosphere. You clean up your act, and then we'll think about it. That's been their historical attitude, and they're very morally indignant about demands that they should move quickly. But they're getting pretty big in the zero emission space. Some of their solar investments are huge. Adani, I think, owns and runs the world's biggest solar farms, famous in Australia for other things. And there's a lot of investment in these new industries, solar and storage of electricity. So coming in and being able to use the technological developments elsewhere and not having such a big industrial base to start with, they might move more quickly than some others. So they're going to be a big part of the story. They're not naturally as complementary in resources as China. But as they become a bigger economy, then the sort of opportunities we see in China will be there in India as well, in both directions. They will be a source of solar panels and batteries, just like China is, and it will be more efficient for them to import iron metal than metallurgical coal from Australia. but it will be a long time before it's anything like the scale.
Terrific. Okay, well, it brings us to 2 o'clock. So thanks, Ross, and thank you for the special circumstances in particular today. And thanks everyone for coming along. Good afternoon to you all. And that's the end of the MEI Network Seminar series this year, but you'll be hearing from us on other things later on. So thank you all. Bye-bye.